On the morning of October 3rd, I got the call from a deputy out in the field. He said that there was a sexual assault on an elderly woman and that she was at the hospital at the time. His initial words were that she was covered with bruises head to toe.
She had been severely beaten from the top of her head, basically to her feet. Bruises on her face, 2 black eyes, bruises on her shoulders, everywhere.
It was clear that she was in a lot of pain and had been brutally attacked.
There was some concern whether she was going to make it or not.
We need to figure out who did this to her.
I came to church in Gravett and met Susan almost 20 years ago. She was the door greeter when you came into church. She had strong religious faith and Christian faith, so she let you know that right up front. Susan was very independent. She lived by herself in a little cabin, and she burned wood for the winter to keep warm. She enjoyed volunteering her time for Care and Share, the organization in Gravett that helped people in the community. I remember seeing her sorting through piles and piles of clothes that people would come up and donate. She was a woman that looks for the good in everything.
Susan, right now what I'd like to do is just start at the very beginning and let you tell me each thing that happened as it happened to the best of your recollection, okay?
Around 1:30, I heard a knock on the door, and he said that his car broke down and he needed to use my phone. So I got my cell phone, shoved it out the door, and closed the door. And then he pretended like he was calling, and he says, "Okay, I'm done, here's your cell phone." So I opened the door and he pushed his way in and grabbed me. And that's when he put that, it's like a table runner on the back of my couch, and he wrapped it around real tight.
And he wrapped it just around your whole face?
Yeah, he was hitting me, and he tied me up with what felt like wire. Oh, and then I think he went into my refrigerator and got some oil, and he was putting that all over me. And he just was pushing me around, and eventually he raped me, and he continued to rape me for like 5 hours. And then he put me in a tub and turned on the shower. Thank God, only through prayer, that he did not kill me.
What did he look like? How good of a look did you get?
I got a glimpse of him when he first came in. He had brown hair, and he wasn't real tall. I would say like 5'10", or not real tall, but strong. He said, "If any car comes in here, I will kill you." And I says, "Nobody ever comes in here. No one ever comes in this driveway." And then he finally left around, 6 or 6:30.
In the morning.
Yeah. I was going to call Care and Share, but I was just feeling weak. I had to lay down for a minute, and then they called me and asked me if I was all right, because I didn't show up, and I always show up. And I asked them to take me to the hospital.
We were very fortunate that she was able to provide lots of clues that I was then able to give to other detectives on what to look for at the house. As far as like an attack and a rape goes, it's probably up there with the most brutal that I've 've 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 'v 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 'v
It was a pretty rural, remote area. I could see that the residents sat 75 yards to 100 yards off the road. So immediately I kind of had the gut feeling that it was somebody that she had known or somebody that she had at least had some type of encounter with previously. I saw equipment outside. I saw some scaffolding, paint, stain, and it looked like to me somebody was recently or currently working on the house. When we opened the door and looked inside, it was a crime scene investigator's nightmare. I could immediately tell that this attack took place over the entire house, upstairs and downstairs. There was water everywhere. There was also an oily substance. We took fingerprints. The entry door was critical. Bed frame, sink, bathtub, all areas where fingerprints are conducive to being left. There was blood. You have to swab that because you know that that contains DNA. You're really under a clock because at that point in time, we still had a violent offender out there, and we needed to get that person, whoever it was, off the streets. I'm relaying to them what I'm seeing at the residence. Like I said, try to find out who's been working on her house.
Have you had anybody out there working on your house lately?
I have.
Who's that?
I have Eric, and he's painting my house.
Red flags go up. I thought that Eric was probably going to be our guy. Obviously, we had to vet that out. Called dispatch, ran the name, immediately was notified that he was a sex offender. Elderly victim, lives alone, a sex offender working on her house, deadly combination. So the next thing was to try to find out where was he at, what is his alibi.
He said he was home all night. They found that he had a surveillance system on his home, and it showed a camera view at the front door, any exits or anything. One of our cybercrimes detectives was able to download and view all of that footage and ultimately was able to see that he never left his home.
Once we talked to Eric, we were able to kind of rule him out. But he brought us on to a coworker of his named Alan Rickman.
He was able to tell them that Alan worked for him at the log cabin. And he described that Alan had been at work in the morning of the attack, that he did act kind of off, and he appeared to have some kind of injury on his arm that he was trying to hide all day.
So, again, red flags that came forward like, okay, now we need to move away from Eric and we need to start focusing on Rickman. I went in and took a look at him, and I could immediately see scratches all over his hands and on his arms. But he had scratches on his legs and things that he could not explain away. We placed him in custody and basically asked at that point in time for permission, consent to search his vehicle.
And we found items in the car that were very concerning. There was women's underwear. Some of those underwear contained blood. There was pornographic magazines. They found like a bottle of oil, cooking oil.
There was also a portable DVD player that we located that had this oily substance on it.
So at this point, it's very suspicious what is found in the vehicle.
We seized the car and brought it back to the sheriff's office and then took Mr. Rickman to the Benton County Jail.
My thought was, this is our guy. All hands on deck. Let's get this done. Detective Matthews. When they arrested you and you let them look in your vehicle, I guess they found some items. So what was it that they found in your vehicle?
Probably girls' clothing and porn.
Susan Hazard, her strength comes from her faith in God. I know that she was standing on that faith the morning that I seen her in the emergency room. She looked up at me and her face was all bruised and beat up. And I just remember just going over to her and laying my head on her, beside her head. I didn't know what else to do but to pray. I just prayed for her. When you have a group of people that you are a pastor over, you feel responsible for them. It would be the same thing if something happened to one of your family members.
Some girls' clothing and porn. Okay. Can you tell me why those would be in your vehicle?
I just do it by myself. Nobody knows I do it.
Nobody else knows. Is that why they were in your trunk and not like in your home?
Mm-hmm.
You ever do that in your home?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And just so you know, I deal with this kind of thing all the time. So you're certainly not going to offend me. So just want you to know that. Every question I ask can be answered with, I want to speak to an attorney, and that's going to stop things. So I want him to know I'm not judging him one way or the other, that I just want to understand.
I like to dress in girls' clothing and look at porn. My family, my mom and people would disown me if they knew I was doing that crap. They wouldn't disown me, but they wouldn't, they wouldn't understand. I've been kind of gay since I was, a kid.
And you say you're kind of gay because you like to dress like women? Is that why you feel you're kind of gay? Is that your sexual preference? Okay. Have you had sex with women before?
Yeah, well, that's what it.
Okay. Have you had sex with men before?
Only a couple.
Couple of times. Okay. But your preference would be men. Okay.
They wouldn't.
Would be women.
Yeah.
Okay, so when you say you're kind of gay, it's more that you have some of those thoughts.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I guess so, yeah. So why are you in here questioning me about my personal, endeavors or whatever?
Well, my concern is that I guess one of the items that they found was some women's underwear with blood inside. So I'm concerned where that blood came from. So, are you able to tell me what that is about?
Yeah, sometimes I like to, do myself, I guess.
Okay. But are you telling me that you were wearing those panties and that would be your blood in those panties?
Yeah.
Okay. In the back of my mind, I'm thinking he's bringing this into play because he is trying to explain another reason why those items are there. I took it as an opening. Let's go ahead and let's talk about what happened. Where do you work?
I work for a general contractor.
For a general contractor? What kind of work do you do? Construction. Who's Eric?
Eric is my boss.
Have you been to a log home on Strawberry Ridge and helped Eric in staining that log home?
Like maybe 3 times.
3 times. Do you know who lives in that house?
I don't even know her name.
You don't know her name? Okay. Is there just one person that lives there?
I think, I'm not sure.
Okay. Did you ever see anybody there?
I seen one woman there.
Did you ever talk to her?
Yeah, a couple times.
Where were you at last night?
I was at home.
And didn't go anywhere else? The reason I'm really concerned about that was there was an incident at the log house and somebody attacked the female that lives there. When we find women's underwear with blood in them, that's going to be a concern. So, were you at her house last night? No. Have you ever done anything more than just seeing her at that house?
Oh, now I'm thinking maybe you need to just give me a lawyer or something. I'm not answering any of your questions.
Okay. Right here, I'll be right back. What immediately went through my mind when he requested a lawyer was, I blew it. I felt frustrated because I'm not going to get him to tell me what happened and to give me the answers.
We brought Alan in on an unrelated warrant, but at some point in time, if we don't have enough evidence, enough probable cause to arrest him for Susan's attack, then yeah, he would have been released from jail and been back out on the streets.
So we've got about 48 hours that we can hold him. So we need to get busy and build that case, hopefully before he gets released. There were several items that were found in Alan's car that we collected, so we took that up to the hospital to show Susan. Maybe she could identify those items as coming out of her home.
She developed sepsis, which, you know, that's deadly. I was concerned. There was a time crunch there. You're trying to get as much information as you can before things take a turn.
So we're going to show you some clothes and some other things, and you just take your time. And if it's not yours, tell us it's not yours. If it is yours, tell us it is yours. Miss Susan, does this look familiar to you?
Does that look like one of your bras?
Yes.
How about this pair of underwear, Susan?
No.
How about this pair? Purple ones.
Yes.
Miss Susan, do you remember yesterday you told us about the suspect had put some oil on you?
Yes.
Does this container look like one that came from your house?
Yes.
How are you feeling right now?
Sick.
She started to go downhill. At one point, they had to intubate her. Obviously, the biggest change is that if she does succumb to these injuries and loses her life because of this attack, then that is a homicide.
Stakes are definitely higher. It's a violent attack, and we all took it a little bit personal. We knew that there was a gas station that was near Susan's house. So we sent a couple of detectives to the gas station, and they were able to find Alan on video going inside the gas station just minutes after he would have left Susan Hazard's house.
At one point, he looks down at his arm when he's inside the store, and he had a gash in his arm. That is important video because it shows the same vehicle that we'd searched by consent at Alan's home, and it corroborates what Susan said as far as the timeline.
We felt like at that point in time, we had our right guy. But obviously you want to get all the evidence you can.
And so detectives found an electrical cord and a remote for a DVD player, but no DVD player.
Also, the instruction manual was still there. Took that, looked at the model, realized that this was the same model DVD player that was in Alan's vehicle.
For me, that was a pivotal moment. That was when I knew this is our guy. This is it.
That DVD player, the stuff in the car, and Susan identifying some of the things as belonging to her. The video evidence that puts him near the scene of the crime. And he had scratches and bruising all over his body. I felt like we had enough probable cause to make an arrest. And then just a short time later, our booking area in the jail called over and said, hey, he's requesting to speak to you again. At that point in time, you jump on that opportunity. We felt like, even before he said a word, like, okay, he's ready to talk.
Hi, Alan. I know you remember I'm Detective Matthews spoke with you a couple of days ago. I understand that you want to talk to me.
I want to ask you a question. Where are y'all getting these 3 counts of rape?
Well, we have evidence that shows that a rape occurred more than one time. So that's why there's more than one count. I can see this is really bothering you, Alan. Okay? Alan's getting upset, emotional. I feel like he was realizing we knew what he had done, and soon the world was going to know what he did.
Here you go. You want tissue? Is your tissue in?
I'll get you a minute. We pretty much know what happened. Okay, the question that we really want to know now is why it happened. From the evidence that we've seen, it's one of two things. Either you were a monster, a serial rapist, or something else happened and got out of hand. Are you a monster? Tell me what happened, Alan. Was it just an accident? Captain Motsinger came in to help progress the interview. Captain Motsinger is a little more forceful with Alan. I approach things as you get more with sugar and vinegar. But that's not always the win. Sometimes it takes somebody coming in there and being stern.
Hey, Alan, look at me. I want you to understand something, okay? Let me give you a scenario, okay? If you got 2 people and they do wrong, and both of them go, let's say, before a judge, and one says, he denies everything, but the other one says, you know what, I made a mistake, have mercy on me. Who do you think the judge is going to have more mercy and compassion? Somebody who acknowledges they made a mistake, right? Okay? Now, I want you to keep this in mind, Alan. Listen to me. We're not here to condemn you, and I don't think you'll be like that. You will answer for what you've done to society. We're not the judge and jury. We're the fact finders. Okay? We're just here to help everybody involved. That's it. I'm not on anybody's side. Things happen for a reason. The judge, the jury, the people make those decisions, not us. Okay? So feel free to talk to us about these things and help us to understand why, so that we can explain to people why. Okay? Let's go back to Monday. Start from Monday morning when you woke up and go through your day Monday. What time did you wake up Monday morning?
Around like 6:30 or so that morning. I went to work.
Okay. What time did you get off work Monday? Was it before dark or after dark?
Before dark.
So what did you do after work Monday?
Went to my house and sat and watched a movie and just sat there and did some math and I don't know really after that.
Okay. And what time did you leave the house Monday night?
I don't remember.
Okay, tell us what you remember, and then we'll just go from there.
The only thing I really remember is kind of snapped into and left.
Where do you remember coming to that?
Upstairs in her bedroom.
In whose bedroom?
What was it?
Look,
I don't know.
was this the older lady's house?
Yeah.
Okay. Was it the lady's house that you've been doing work at? Do you know her name?
You just said it was Susan or something.
Okay. Describe the inside of that house for me. You said you were upstairs. What's it look like? Alan?
I just told you. I just told you. I don't understand why you keep doing that to me.
Because I want to know what happened. From your perspective, I want to know what happened. Look, Alan, stop crying. I want to know what happened from your perspective. And I want to know why. That's what I want to know.
I don't know.
Well, look at me. Look, I don't want you to lie.
I don't know.
You don't know why you did it? I can't. Listen to me, Alan. I can't understand you. You can't believe you did that? Listen. Listen to me. What did you do at the house? People make mistakes. But the thing you gotta do from here is make it right. Right? That's all you gotta do. And that's what we wanna know. We just wanna know what happened and why.
I ripped the woman.
You raped that woman? Okay, look at me. What does that mean?
I guess I just learned out of her bed and had sex with her.
Did she tell you no? Was it consensual? Or are you telling me it's consensual? From us and everyone on the outside looking in, when you start telling lies and you start, you kind of minimize things, it makes it worse. Because then people don't believe you.
I'm not minimizing anything.
Okay. I'm going to go get me some water, and I'm going to let you talk to Detective Matthews some more. But I want to go through your entire day and how you wound up there. And what happened when you left. Because, see, if you left there with the intention of her dying, that's a problem. And we need to know those things. That's why we ask you these questions.
I can tell you right now whenever I leave there with the intention of her dying.
Okay, that's fine. That's the things that we need answered, okay? So we'll let Detective Matthews go through everything with you, okay?
So you'd been drinking, and you did some meth, and then you drove to her house.
Yeah, I remember being in her room.
Being in her room? In her bedroom? Where were her hands? Do you remember where her hands were?
I'm beside her. I think she had a phone charger tied to her.
Or like the cord for a phone charger? Okay. What was it tied to?
Hands.
Her hands. And her waist?
That's really all I remember. I mean, really, she was in it. I felt really super bad, and I didn't.
Did you say you were super mad?
Really super bad. I felt really super bad.
Did you take anything with you when you left?
Took her portable DVD player.
A portable DVD player? Okay. Why did you do that?
I don't know.
Okay.
It's because there was a porn in it or something.
Do you remember where you went when you left her house?
Across the store, maybe.
And then what did you do after that?
I did that. I went to work. I had to go to work.
Do you remember going into the refrigerator or any of the kitchen cupboards? Do you remember going into the bathroom?
I think so.
I don't think so.
I don't know. I don't remember.
Alan he was kind of sticking to the I don't know. And sometimes then you can get in that loop, and Captain Motsinger has come in and he's trying to be a little more firm and kind of snap back to reality. You do know. Let's talk about it.
I will tell you this, that she has been flown or taken to Springfield Hospital, and she's on a breathing apparatus, so it doesn't look really good for her. And it's something else that you should really think about. Because if she passes away, like I said, it's not going to be really good at all.
There's obviously something wrong with me.
And that's why we're here. Maybe you need help. Hey, Alan, let's go back to... But let me ask you a question. Why did you go there that day? That night?
I don't know.
Here, look. You know why you went out there. What time did you go out there? What time do you think it was? An approximate. The best guess.
I don't know.
Okay. Did you stop anywhere along the way?
I don't know, really.
Yeah, you know.
No, I really don't.
Yeah, you remember that. See, the thing is with meth, it doesn't affect your memory, it affects your actions, okay? So don't tell me that. I don't believe that. I've been doing this a long time, okay?
You can say what you want to say, man, but I don't remember.
Okay, no, listen. Don't insult my intelligence, and don't insult her intelligence by trying to say that. I've been doing this too long, and I'm 50 years old, okay? I wasn't born yesterday. So just don't play me like that. I know you remember. I know you know.
God, man, why are you making me go back through all this again?
There's no such thing as selective memory, okay? There's no way you can pick a part over here, I can remember that, and pick a part over here, I can't remember that, okay? So just be honest, yeah. Just be honest.
Pulled up into her driveway. I knocked on her door.
Mm-hmm.
She answered it. Pushed the door open on her.
Then what happened?
And I proceeded to take her clothes off and have sex with her. And I noticed that she was bleeding a lot. So I took her downstairs and washed her off.
You raped her, right? Because she wasn't consenting, was she?
Yeah.
Here's part of the thing is she's got a lot of bruising on her. A tremendous amount of bruising. Her eyes are black and she's got some injuries. How did she get those injuries?
I smacked her in the side of her head twice.
Can you explain to me about the black eyes?
I don't understand why she bruised like she did. But I didn't really beat on her.
Okay, tell me why you did that.
I did because I don't know.
Were you angry?
No, I don't know.
The clothes that were in your car, did any of those clothes come from her house?
I'm not sure. I mean, I've had these panties for freaking ever. I took underwear from different places I was at. I'd take them from homes.
Okay, is any of that her blood?
I don't know.
Okay. You told us part of it, but I'd like to still know why. I'd like to know why.
Why I did what I did.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know why I did what I did. I don't know why.
You've got to know. You're the one that did it.
I just did it.
No. Stop.
I don't know.
Look, stop the theatrics, okay?
Can we done, please?
Yep. Let me. We're gonna have to put the handcuffs on you. Go outside. Give me just a second. And I'll get you squared up, okay? You got any questions for us, Alan? You got any questions for us? Okay. Thank you for visiting with us.
Back, Aaron.
And we'll be right back, okay?
We felt like we had got everything that we needed to corroborate with the physical evidence and the story that Susan had told. So once the interview was over, it felt good because you get the who, what, when, where, how.
Y'all stand up for him.
The why is the one thing that you rarely get. And maybe Alan doesn't even know the why. And we don't always know.
It was a case that shocks the conscience. It's the most violent, brutal sexual assault that I've ever worked.
Solving this case and getting justice for Susan was so important because the magnitude. This one stands out more because of the victim and the victim's attitude and the life she led.
Susan was at the brink of death, but she has faith in the one that can save her soul. And that's where her strength comes from, her faith.
I tell everyone, no one can keep you from prayer. And so I remember the silent prayer that I prayed. I said, Jesus, I want to live. I need to survive. After they took me to the Gravett Hospital, I got worse and they rushed me to the ICU. And so I don't remember anything after that. I don't know what happens to your brain when you're in a coma, but to me, I was in East Africa. And I was setting these women free out of this house. I remember the nurse came into my room after I woke up, and so she asked me, do you know where you are? And I said, I'm in East Africa. It was a long healing process. Because of the sepsis, my hands literally died and my feet. So the doctor said that we need to amputate your hands or you're gonna die. A week later or so, they had to amputate my legs below the knee. There was never any doubt. I was gonna do what I needed to do to gradually be able to learn to walk.
He wanted to plead guilty, but we felt like it was a rock-solid case, and the prosecution wanted to take it to trial and give Susan her day in court, and that's exactly what happened.
I have peace about it all. Now I just go on with the life I have. I walked in this 5K, and so I kind of joke about it. I say my goal is to come in last, and I always reach my goal. But it's just fun.
I signed up for the same 5K, so we walked the last mile together. And we even talked about making it an annual event, so I'm looking forward to that.
When I was growing up, my father forgave others. And so I learned that from an early age. And so I knew it was important, and I forgave him as quickly as I could. When I talk to people, I end up with the importance of forgiveness.
The night air over Las Vegas carried a strange kind of warmth that only deserts know how to hold onto after sunset. It wrapped itself around the thousands of people gathered below, settling over bare shoulders, denim jackets, and plastic cups sweating in the crowd. Laughter drifted through the open space like something alive, rising and falling with the rhythm of country music echoing from the stage. Under the glow of stage lights, the festival felt almost unreal, like a temporary world stitched together out of music, neon, and the quiet promise that nothing bad could reach this place tonight. People had come here for different reasons, but they all shared the same illusion. Some were chasing music, others were chasing escape. Couples leaned into each other, their heads close, speaking in fragments between songs. Friends shouted lyrics they only half remembered. Boots tapped against the dry ground, kicking up dust that hung in the air like a soft haze. Phones lit up faces from below, capturing moments that would later feel impossibly distant, like memories from another lifetime. Above them, towering silently against the dark sky, stood the Mandalay Bay. Its windows reflected the city lights, each one a small square of gold floating in blackness. From below, it looked harmless. Just another building among many, another part of the skyline that people barely noticed after a while. No one in the crowd looked up long enough to wonder what was happening behind those windows. No one imagined that one of them wasn't just reflecting light, but hiding something. Inside that building, far above the music and laughter, the air was different. It was still, controlled, detached from everything happening below. The room itself gave nothing away. Curtains drawn. Furniture undisturbed except for what had been carefully arranged. It didn't look like chaos. It didn't look like madness. It looked deliberate. Quiet. Patient. And then, without warning, the illusion shattered. At first, the sound didn't make sense. It cracked through the music, sharp and unnatural, like something tearing through the fabric of the night. For a split second, people hesitated. Some thought it was part of the show, fireworks, maybe. Something theatrical. Something meant to excite. But there was no pattern to it. No rhythm that matched the music. It came in bursts, fast, relentless, mechanical. The sound didn't stop. Confusion spread faster than fear. Heads turned in every direction, searching for something to anchor reality. But there was nothing to see, only the stage lights still burning bright, the band still playing for a moment too long, unaware or unwilling to believe what was happening. And then the music stopped. That's when the screaming began. It started in pockets, scattered and uncertain, before swelling into something overwhelming. People dropped to the ground, instinct taking over before understanding could catch up. Others ran, not knowing where to go, only that standing still felt like a mistake they couldn't afford. The open space that had once felt freeing now became terrifyingly exposed. The sound kept coming from above. Bullets cut through the air with a speed that no one could process, striking at random, turning ordinary moments into irreversible endings. A man reaching for his drink collapsed before his fingers could close around it. A woman laughing seconds earlier was suddenly pulled to the ground by someone screaming her name. The dust that had been kicked up by dancing feet now mixed with something darker, something heavier. Time broke apart. Seconds stretched into something unbearable, each one filled with noise and movement and the desperate need to survive. People crawled behind barriers that offered little protection. Others threw themselves over strangers, instinctively trying to shield them from something they couldn't even see. The crowd that had been unified by music was now fragmented by fear, each person trapped in their own moment of chaos. Above it all, the source remained invisible. From one of those glowing windows in the Mandalay Bay, a man stood alone. Stephen Paddock, 64 years old, separated from the scene below not just by distance, but by something deeper, something harder to define. There was no shouting from him, no visible rage carried down to the crowd. Only the cold, repetitive action of a trigger being pulled again and again. The distance made it worse. There was no warning, no confrontation, no chance to react in any meaningful way. The attack didn't come from within the crowd, where it might have been seen, understood, stopped. It came from above, from a place no one had thought to fear. The angle turned the festival into something like a target, wide and exposed, with nowhere truly safe to go. Sirens began to rise in the distance, faint at first, then growing louder as reality finally caught up with what was unfolding. But even as emergency responders moved toward the scene, the shooting continued. 10 minutes. 15 minutes. It felt longer. It felt endless. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. The silence that followed wasn't quiet. It was filled with everything the noise had pushed aside, the cries for help, the panicked voices calling out names, the disoriented murmurs of people trying to understand if they were alive, if the person next to them was alive, if this was over or just paused. No one moved right away. Not because they didn't want to, but because they didn't know if it was safe. The absence of sound felt like a trap, like something that could break at any moment and start again. Eyes turned upward, searching the windows that all looked the same now, each one equally threatening. Somewhere above, in that same room where everything had been so carefully arranged, Stephen Paddock was already gone. By the time authorities forced their way inside, the story they would find wouldn't answer the question that had already begun to form in the minds of everyone who survived. Why? Because that question doesn't disappear with the sound of gunfire. It lingers. It settles into the spaces left behind, the empty seats, the unfinished conversations, the phones that would never be answered again. It embeds itself into the memories of those who were there, replaying the moment when confusion turned into terror, when a night meant for music became something else entirely. From the outside, the timeline would seem clear. A man checks into a hotel. He brings with him more than 20 firearms. He prepares. He waits. And then he acts. But clarity in sequence does not mean clarity in meaning. What transforms preparation into action? What bridges the gap between an ordinary life and an act of extraordinary violence? Inside that hotel room, there were no signs of struggle. No indication of hesitation. Only the evidence of a plan carried out with precision. Cameras positioned to monitor the hallway. Weapons arranged within reach. Ammunition stacked and ready. Everything suggested control. But control over what? The question deepens when the answers don't come. Investigators would dig through records, trace movements, analyze every detail they could find. They would reconstruct the hours leading up to the attack, the days, the months, even the years. They would look for patterns, for triggers, for anything that could transform this from an incomprehensible act into something that could at least be explained. And still, the silence would remain. Because sometimes the most unsettling part of a story isn't what we know, it's what we don't. Back on the ground, under the fading lights of the festival, reality was still being pieced together in fragments. People helped strangers to their feet, their hands shaking, their movements uncertain. Others stood frozen, staring at the space where something, or someone, had been just moments before. Emergency lights painted everything in flashes of red and blue, cutting through the darkness in sharp, disorienting bursts. The night hadn't ended. It had changed. And for those who were there, it would never truly be over. Because the moment the first shot rang out, something irreversible had already happened. Not just to the people in that crowd, but to the city itself. To the idea that even in a place built on illusion and spectacle, there were still boundaries that wouldn't be crossed. That belief was gone now. And in its place, a story began to take shape. A story not just about what happened that night, but about the questions that followed. About the lives that were interrupted, the ones that were lost, and the one man at the center of it all. A man whose silence would become one of the most haunting parts of the entire case. Because sometimes, the loudest thing in a story is what's missing. To understand how a night like that could fracture so completely, you have to step back from the chaos and look at the stage that held it all together just hours before. Not the stage where the music played, but the larger one, the city itself, the culture it cultivated, and the quiet assumptions people carried with them when they arrived in Las Vegas. Las Vegas has always existed in a kind of contradiction. It is a place built on spectacle, where excess is not just accepted but expected. Lights never dim unless they are replaced by brighter ones. Time feels optional. The line between day and night dissolves into a continuous blur of activity, a place where people come not to confront reality, but to temporarily step outside of it. The city doesn't just entertain, it reassures. It tells its visitors that they are safe within its carefully curated illusions. That sense of safety is not accidental. It is engineered. Casinos hum with a constant undercurrent of surveillance. Security cameras watch every angle, every movement, every transaction. Staff members are trained to notice what doesn't fit, what doesn't belong. On the surface, it creates a paradox, a place known for risk that feels controlled, even predictable. Visitors rarely think about the systems behind the scenes, but they feel their effects. They trust that someone, somewhere, is paying attention. Just off the southern end of the strip, away from the densest concentration of neon and noise, stood the Mandalay Bay. Its gold-tinted windows reflected the desert sun by day and the electric glow of the city by night. It wasn't the oldest or the most extravagant building in Las Vegas, but it carried a certain presence. A sense of distance from the chaos without ever being disconnected from it. From the outside, Mandalay Bay projected calm. Inside, it offered everything its guests expected: luxury, anonymity, and the quiet promise that whatever happened within its walls would remain separate from the outside world. Guests came and went without drawing attention. Luggage rolled across polished floors. Elevators carried people upward into private spaces that felt detached from everything below. That anonymity was part of the appeal. It meant no one asked too many questions. Across the street, separated by distance, but tied together by purpose, the Route 91 Harvest Festival unfolded in an open lot that had been transformed into something temporary and vibrant. It wasn't just a concert. It was an experience carefully designed to feel personal despite the scale. Country music fans gathered from across the country, drawn not just by the lineup, but by the atmosphere. It was intimate in the way only large crowds can be when everyone shares the same energy. The ground was uneven, packed dirt that held on to the heat of the day. By nightfall, it released that warmth slowly, creating a lingering haze that mixed with the smell of food trucks, spilled beer, and dust. String lights stretched across sections of the venue, softening the edges of the space. The stage stood at one end, a focal point that anchored the crowd, drawing thousands of individual experiences into a single shared moment. People didn't come here expecting perfection. They came for authenticity. They came to sing along, to feel something real. For many, this wasn't their first festival. It was part of a ritual, something they returned to year after year. Familiar faces appeared in unexpected places. Conversations picked up where they had left off months before. There was comfort in that repetition, in the idea that some things stayed the same. But even rituals rely on fragile assumptions. The layout of the festival, like most outdoor events, prioritized access and visibility. Open sight lines allowed the crowd to see the stage from almost anywhere. Entrances were designed to handle large volumes of people efficiently. Security checkpoints focused on what was being brought into the venue: bags, coolers, anything that might disrupt the experience from within. The threat model was inward-facing. It always had been. What happened outside the perimeter, beyond the fences and barricades, was rarely considered a direct risk. Buildings nearby were part of the environment, not part of the equation. They existed in the background, static and unchanging, like scenery in a play that no one expects to move. And yet, one of those buildings held a vantage point that would redefine everything. From certain rooms inside Mandalay Bay, the festival grounds were clearly visible. Not in detail, not in a way that revealed individual faces, but in a broad, sweeping view that captured the density of the crowd, the positioning of the stage, the movement of lights and bodies below. It was a perspective that flattened the complexity of the scene into something simpler, something easier to interpret at a distance. From above, the crowd became a pattern. Predictable. Concentrated. Exposed. Inside the city, systems were designed to manage risk through visibility and control. But those systems were not built to account for someone who would operate outside of them, someone who would use the city's own structure as an advantage rather than a limitation. And then there was the man himself. Stephen Paddock did not fit the profile people expected when they thought about violence on this scale. He wasn't young. He wasn't impulsive in the way people often imagine. At 64, he carried the outward appearance of someone who had lived a long, uneventful life. A retiree. A gambler. Someone who moved through the world without drawing attention. That was part of what made him invisible. He had spent years frequenting casinos, blending into environments where people came specifically to disappear into the crowd. He understood the rhythms of places like Las Vegas, the constant movement, the anonymity, the way people focused on their own experiences rather than those of strangers around them. He understood how not to be noticed. In the days leading up to October 1st, his actions followed a pattern that, on the surface, didn't seem extraordinary. He checked into Mandalay Bay like any other guest. He brought luggage with him, more than most, but not enough to immediately raise suspicion in a place accustomed to excess. Over time, he transported items into his room, piece by piece, without urgency. There was no visible rush. No outward sign of what was being assembled behind closed doors. The room itself became a contained environment, separate from the systems designed to monitor public spaces. Housekeeping entered and exited according to schedule, seeing only what was left in plain view. Hallways remained quiet, cameras capturing movement without context. Each small action, taken on its own, appeared unremarkable. It was only in hindsight that the pattern became visible. And by then, it was too late. The broader context of the time matters, too. In 2017, mass shootings were already part of the national conversation in the HOA CAI. They were discussed, debated, analyzed. But they were often understood through a specific lens: schools, workplaces, places where the threat originated from within. The idea of an attack coming from a distant, elevated position, targeting a large outdoor event, wasn't part of the common framework. It existed, but only in theory. Not in expectation. That gap between theory and expectation is where vulnerability lives. Las Vegas, for all its complexity, relied on a simple promise: that what people came here for would remain separate from the dangers they left behind. It offered a controlled escape, a place where risks were calculated and contained. But that promise depended on boundaries, physical, psychological, and procedural. On the night of October 1st, those boundaries were tested in a way no one had fully prepared for. The setting was perfect in the way tragedies often are, not because it invited what happened, but because it allowed it to unfold without immediate interruption. A large, concentrated crowd. An elevated position with a clear line of sight. Systems designed to manage internal threats, not external ones. And a man who understood how to exist within those systems without triggering them. All of these elements came together quietly, almost invisibly, long before the first shot was fired. They formed a backdrop that, once understood, makes the events of that night feel both shocking and, in a deeply unsettling way, inevitable. Because the setting doesn't just frame the story. It shapes what becomes possible within it. Before the headlines reduced them to numbers, before their names were spoken in somber sequences across news broadcasts, the people gathered at the Route 91 Harvest Festival were individuals carrying entire worlds within them. Each person who stepped onto that dusty ground brought a history that stretched far beyond that single night, a network of relationships, memories, and quiet dreams that had nothing to do with tragedy. To understand what was lost, you have to slow down and look at them not as a crowd, but as lives unfolding in real time, unaware of how fragile that unfolding really was. There was a woman standing near the center of the field, her boots pressed into the uneven dirt, her weight shifting from one foot to the other in rhythm with the music. She had flown in from the Midwest with two of her closest friends, a trip they had planned months in advance. For her, this wasn't just a concert. It was a pause. A break from long shifts at a hospital where the fluorescent lights never dimmed and the emotional weight never fully lifted. She had spent her days caring for others, absorbing their pain in quiet, professional ways, and tonight was supposed to be something different. Tonight, she allowed herself to be just another face in the crowd, singing along to songs that felt lighter than anything she dealt with back home. A few rows behind her stood a couple, who had only recently started dating. They were still in that early stage where everything felt new, where even small gestures carried significance. He had insisted on coming to this festival, because it reminded him of his childhood, of road trips and radio stations that faded in and out as his family crossed state lines. She didn't know the songs as well, but she knew him, and that was enough. She watched the way his face changed when the music started, how he seemed more relaxed, more open. She memorized those details without realizing she was doing it, storing them somewhere she would return to later. Closer to the stage, a group of friends from HOA CAI had formed a loose circle, their laughter spilling outward into the surrounding space. They had driven for hours to be there, piling into a car that felt too small for the journey, but somehow perfect for the experience. Their conversations overlapped, stories interrupted and picked up again, without anyone losing track. They were the kind of group that made space for others without thinking about it, pulling strangers into their orbit with an easy sense of belonging. Among them was a man who had recently become a father. He showed pictures of his newborn to anyone who would look. His phone passed from hand to hand as if the images themselves carried some kind of pride that needed to be shared. He talked about sleepless nights, but there was no exhaustion in his voice, only something softer, something that suggested his entire understanding of the future had shifted in ways he was still trying to articulate. Scattered throughout the crowd were people who had come alone, drawn by the promise of music and the comfort of anonymity. One of them stood near the edge of the venue, her arms crossed loosely as she took in the scene. She wasn't antisocial. She just preferred to experience things on her own terms. For her, the festival was a space where she could exist without explanation, where she didn't have to perform for anyone or meet expectations she carried in other parts of her life. She watched the stage, but she also watched the people, noticing small interactions that others might miss. A few feet away, a man in his 50s leaned against a barrier, his posture relaxed in a way that suggested he had learned not to rush moments like this. He had attended countless concerts over the years, each one blending into the next, but he still found something new in the experience every time. Maybe it was the crowd, maybe it was the music, or maybe it was just the reminder that life continued to offer these brief, shared spaces where strangers could feel connected without needing to understand each other fully. There were younger faces too, people in their early 20s who carried a different kind of energy. For them, the night wasn't about nostalgia or escape from routine. It was about possibility. About being exactly where they wanted to be, surrounded by people who seemed to understand that feeling without needing to say it out loud. They documented everything, their phones capturing fragments of the experience that they would later stitch together into something that felt complete. But the truth is, no recording could ever hold what that night actually was. Because what defined it wasn't just the music or the setting. It was the way all of these lives intersected in that single space, overlapping in ways that felt both random and meaningful. People who would never meet again shared brief moments of connection, a smile, a nod, a few words exchanged over the noise of the crowd. These interactions were small, almost insignificant on their own, but together they created something larger, something that gave the night its shape. And within that shape were stories that extended far beyond the boundaries of the festival. There was a teacher who had spent years working in underfunded schools, finding ways to reach students who had already begun to disengage from the idea of education. She didn't talk about her work often, not because it wasn't important, but because it was difficult to explain the kind of impact she hoped to have. That night, she wasn't thinking about lesson plans or classroom challenges. She was thinking about the music, about the way it allowed her to step outside of her responsibilities, even if only for a few hours. There was a veteran who had returned home with experiences he rarely shared. Crowds didn't always feel comfortable to him, but this one was different. The atmosphere was open, the energy predictable in a way that felt manageable. He stayed near the edges, giving himself space to move if he needed to, but he didn't feel the same tension he often carried in other crowded environments. For once, he allowed himself to relax. There was a mother who had left her children with a relative for the weekend, a decision that had taken more planning than she cared to admit. She loved her kids deeply, but she also understood the importance of stepping away, of reconnecting with parts of herself that existed before she became responsible for others. She checked her phone occasionally, not out of concern, but out of habit, smiling at messages that reassured her everything was fine. All of these lives, all of these stories, existed simultaneously in that space, each one moving forward without any indication of what was about to happen. They were grounded in the present, in the immediate experience of the festival, in the music and the connections and the small details that made the night feel real. None of them were thinking about danger. Not in any immediate sense. Because danger, when it's distant, becomes abstract. It exists in news reports, in conversations that feel removed from personal experience. It's something that happens elsewhere, to other people, under different circumstances. It doesn't belong in moments like this, in places designed for celebration and connection. That assumption is part of what made the night possible. And part of what made what followed so devastating. Because when the first shot rang out, it didn't just interrupt a moment. It collided with all of these lives at once, cutting through stories that had been building long before that night and would continue, in altered forms, long after. The woman from the Midwest would later remember the exact song that was playing, the way the lyrics seemed to dissolve into noise as confusion took hold. The couple would hold on to each other in ways that transformed their relationship from something new into something tested by fear. The group of friends would scatter and regroup, their shared experience shifting from one of joy to one of survival. Each person would carry the night forward in their own way. But in this moment, before everything changed, they were simply people. Living their lives. Standing in a field under the warm desert air, believing, without question, that they were safe. The moment itself did not arrive with a warning. It didn't build slowly, or announce its presence in a way the human mind could prepare for. It came abruptly, violently cutting through the fragile sense of normalcy that had settled over the festival grounds. 1 second, the night belonged to music and movement. The next, it belonged to something else entirely, something that didn't ask for permission to exist. At first, the sound fractured the rhythm rather than replacing it. A sharp, unfamiliar crack sliced through the music echoing across the open field, just loud enough to disrupt, but not yet enough to define. The band on stage continued for a few beats, their performance momentarily disconnected from what was happening beyond the edge of their awareness. In the crowd, people hesitated, their bodies reacting before their minds could assign meaning. Some turned their heads toward the source of the noise, others laughed it off, assuming it was part of the show. But then it came again. And again. Faster this time. Sustained. Relentless. The illusion didn't shatter all at once, it splintered. Confusion spread unevenly, moving through the crowd in waves. Some people dropped instinctively, their bodies recognizing danger before their thoughts could catch up. Others remained standing, scanning the space around them, trying to locate something that refused to be seen. The sound didn't come from the stage. It didn't come from within the crowd. It came from somewhere else, somewhere above and distant, and that distance made it harder to understand. Then the music stopped. Silence from the stage created a vacuum, and into that vacuum rushed something raw and unfiltered. Screams. Shouts. Names being called out in rising panic. The scattered uncertainty coalesced into a single, overwhelming realization that spread like electricity: this was not part of the show. People began to move, but not in any organized way. Movement was driven by instinct, not direction. Some ran toward the exits, their paths colliding with others doing the same. Some dropped flat against the ground, pressing themselves into the dirt as if it could absorb them, make them invisible. Others froze, caught between the urge to flee and the inability to process where safety might be. The open space that had felt freeing just minutes earlier now became terrifyingly exposed. From above, from one of the high floors of Mandalay Bay, Stephen Paddock continued. The distance between him and the crowd created a chilling asymmetry. He could see the mass of people below, their density, their movement, their lack of cover. They, in turn, could not see him. Not clearly. Not in a way that allowed them to understand or confront the source of the danger. That imbalance shaped everything that followed. The bursts of gunfire came in rapid succession, tearing through the night with mechanical precision. Each sequence felt both immediate and endless, compressing time into something disorienting. People tried to make sense of patterns where none existed, searching for pauses, for gaps, for anything that might signal a chance to move safely. There were no clear signals. Only moments of silence that felt as threatening as the noise itself. In those brief lulls, people moved. They ran, crawled, stumbled over uneven ground and over each other. Makeshift barriers became points of desperate refuge, metal fences, vendor booths, anything that offered even the illusion of protection. Some tried to help others, pulling them along, lifting them when they fell, refusing to leave even when staying increased their own risk. Others made impossible decisions in fractions of a second. A man shielded a woman he had never met, his body instinctively placing itself between her and the unseen threat. A group of friends, who had been standing shoulder to shoulder just moments earlier, found themselves separated, each one forced to choose a direction, without knowing where the others had gone. A couple held on to each other so tightly that their grip became the only constant in a world that had suddenly lost all sense of stability. The ground told its own story. Dust that had once risen lightly under dancing feet now clung to bodies pressed flat against it. Personal belongings lay scattered, hats, phones, drinks abandoned mid-motion. Objects that had been part of the evening's casual joy now became markers of abrupt interruption, evidence of how quickly everything had changed. Some people didn't move at all. Not because they chose not to, but because they couldn't. Around them, the chaos continued, the noise rising and falling in unpredictable waves. Those who could still act found themselves navigating not just their own fear, but the reality of others who needed help. Hands reached out, sometimes finding someone to pull along, sometimes grasping at empty air. Time stretched and compressed in ways that defied logic. Seconds felt like minutes. Minutes felt like something unmeasurable. The sound of sirens began to weave into the chaos, distant at first, then gradually more pronounced. Emergency responders were moving toward the scene, but the scale of what was happening meant that their arrival, however fast, could not immediately contain it. The shooting continued, each burst reinforcing the sense that this was not a momentary incident, but something sustained, something deliberate. Inside the hotel room, far removed from the immediate consequences, the environment remained controlled. Stephen Paddock operated within a space he had prepared in advance, his actions unfolding according to a plan that had been set in motion long before the first shot was fired. The contrast between that controlled interior and the chaos below was stark, almost impossible to reconcile. From his vantage point, the crowd was not a collection of individuals. It was a target. Back on the ground, the human reality of that abstraction played out in real time. People called out for loved ones, their voices cutting through the noise with a kind of desperation that carried beyond words. Some searched frantically, moving against the flow of those trying to escape, driven by the need to find someone specific in a sea of strangers. Others focused on survival in its most immediate sense. Get low. Move. Keep moving. The instructions passed between people were simple, urgent, and often contradictory, shaped by incomplete information and the need to act quickly. There was no central voice guiding the response, no clear authority in those first moments. Just individuals doing what they could with what they had. And then, after what felt like an unending sequence of bursts and pauses, it stopped. Not gradually. Completely. The absence of gunfire created a new kind of tension. Silence settled over the scene, but it was not a peaceful silence. It was heavy, uncertain, filled with questions that had no immediate answers. People remained where they were for a moment longer, as if waiting for confirmation that it was truly over. Some began to rise cautiously, their movements slow, deliberate. Others stayed down, unwilling to risk standing until they were certain the danger had passed. The crowd, once unified by shared experience, now existed in fragments, each person processing the aftermath in their own way. Above them, the windows of Mandalay Bay reflected the same city lights as before, giving no indication of which one had been the source. The building looked unchanged, its exterior offering no clues to what had just occurred within. But everything had changed. The festival was no longer a place of music and connection. It had become something else entirely, a scene marked by interruption, by loss, by the sudden intrusion of violence into a space that had not been designed to hold it. For those who had been there, the moment would not end with the silence. It would continue, replaying in fragments, in memories that refused to settle into a single, coherent narrative. The confusion, the fear, the instinctive actions taken without thought, these would become part of a story that each person would carry forward, shaping how they understood not just that night, but the world around them. Because the incident was not just defined by what happened. It was defined by how it felt to be inside it, in those moments when nothing made sense and everything mattered at once. When the gunfire stopped, the world did not return to what it had been. It didn't snap back into place, or offer any sense of closure. Instead, the silence revealed something far more difficult to process. The space that had been filled with movement and music just minutes earlier now carried a different kind of weight, one that settled slowly, but unmistakably over everything it touched. At ground level, the first moments after the shooting ended were defined by uncertainty. People didn't know if it was truly over. They didn't know if there were more shooters, more danger waiting somewhere beyond their line of sight. That uncertainty held them in place even as instinct urged them to move. Some stayed pressed against the ground, their bodies rigid, listening for any sign that the noise might return. Others began to rise carefully, scanning their surroundings with eyes that struggled to make sense of what they were seeing. The festival grounds had changed in ways that were both immediate and difficult to fully grasp. The open space that had once felt alive now felt fractured, broken into pockets of activity and stillness. In some areas, people moved quickly, helping each other, guiding the injured toward exits or makeshift safe zones. In others, there was a kind of suspended quiet, where individuals stood or knelt, their attention fixed on something in front of them that held them in place. Emergency responders began to arrive in greater numbers, their presence bringing a shift in focus. The chaos didn't disappear, but it started to take on a different structure. Voices that had been filled with panic now carried urgency with purpose. Instructions were given, repeated, sometimes shouted, sometimes spoken close and direct. Hands moved with intention, applying pressure, lifting, carrying, stabilizing. The ground itself told a story that no single witness could fully capture. Personal belongings lay scattered across the dirt, items that had been part of ordinary moments just minutes before. A phone still lit up with an unfinished message. A hat trampled into the dust. A pair of boots left behind near the edge of a barrier. These objects remained where they had fallen, silent markers of interruption, each one connected to a person whose night had been altered in ways that could not yet be understood. As responders moved through the scene, they worked not just against time, but against the scale of what had happened. The number of people affected created a challenge that extended beyond immediate visibility. Some injuries were obvious, drawing attention quickly. Others were less apparent, hidden beneath shock or masked by the confusion of the moment. People who appeared unhurt would later realize the extent of what they had experienced, their bodies and minds processing the event on different timelines. Outside the festival grounds, the city of Las Vegas began to respond in its own way. Roads were closed, traffic redirected, emergency routes established. Hospitals activated protocols designed for large-scale incidents, preparing to receive patients in numbers that exceeded normal expectations. Medical staff moved quickly, setting up additional space, gathering supplies, coordinating with first responders who relayed information as it became available. Back at the scene, law enforcement faced a different kind of urgency. While medical teams focused on saving lives, officers worked to understand the source of the attack, to ensure that the threat had been contained. The direction of the gunfire had already been identified, high above, within Mandalay Bay. That realization shaped their next actions, narrowing the focus while raising new questions. Inside the hotel, the environment stood in stark contrast to the chaos below. The lobby remained largely intact, its polished surfaces reflecting a reality that seemed disconnected from the events unfolding outside. Guests who had been inside during the shooting began to process what they had heard, what they had seen, what it might mean. Some moved toward exits, guided by staff and security, while others remained in place, waiting for instructions that would help them understand what was happening. Officers moved through the building with purpose, their attention fixed on locating the exact room from which the shots had been fired. Information came in fragments, pieced together from witness accounts, surveillance footage, and the direction of the sound itself. Each piece narrowed the search, guiding them upward through the structure, floor by floor. The higher they went, the quieter it became. Hallways stretched out in front of them, lined with identical doors that revealed nothing from the outside. The normal sounds of a hotel, voices, televisions, movement, were replaced by something more subdued, more cautious. Doors remained closed. Lights filtered out from beneath them, unchanged, as if the world inside each room continued on its own separate track. But one room stood apart. When officers reached the floor associated with the gunfire, the atmosphere shifted. The sense of proximity to the source created a different kind of tension, one that was sharper, more focused. Evidence of preparation began to emerge even before the room itself was breached. A camera positioned in the hallway, set up to monitor movement outside the door. It was a detail that spoke not of impulse, but of planning, of someone who had anticipated the response and taken steps to observe it. The door itself became a threshold between two realities. On one side, the structured environment of the hotel, controlled and predictable. On the other, something unknown, something that had already proven its capacity for violence. Officers prepared carefully, aware that whatever lay beyond that door could still pose a threat. The possibility of explosives, additional weapons, or other hazards shaped their approach, slowing it down even as urgency pressed against every second. When they finally entered, the scene inside did not resemble chaos in the way the festival grounds did. It was organized, deliberate. Weapons arranged within reach. Ammunition stacked in quantities that suggested preparation far beyond a single moment. The room itself bore the marks of what had taken place, but it also carried evidence of what had been intended. And there, within that space, they found Stephen Paddock. He was no longer an active threat. The immediate danger he had posed had ended before they arrived. But his presence in that room transformed the investigation from a search into something else. A process of understanding, of reconstructing how and why this had happened. The discovery did not bring clarity. It raised new questions. Back outside, the work continued. The process of documenting the scene began even as emergency response efforts remained underway. Investigators moved carefully, preserving evidence while navigating the practical realities of a large and complex environment. Each detail mattered. Each fragment contributed to a broader picture that was still forming. Witnesses began to recount what they had experienced, their accounts overlapping and diverging in ways that reflected the chaos of the moment. Some described the sound, the direction, the way it had felt to realize what was happening. Others focused on specific actions, where they had moved, who they had helped, what they had seen in the faces of those around them. These early accounts were raw, unfiltered, shaped by shock and incomplete information. But they were essential. They provided the first layer of understanding, a foundation upon which further investigation would build. As the night gave way to early morning, the scale of the event became more apparent. Numbers began to take shape, each one representing a life affected, a story interrupted. But even as those numbers were reported, they could not capture the full reality of what had occurred. Because the discovery phase is not just about identifying facts. It is about confronting the gap between what was expected and what actually happened. In that gap, investigators, responders, and survivors alike began to piece together a narrative that would continue to evolve in the days and weeks that followed. A narrative built not just on evidence, but on the lived experience of those who had been there, those who had seen the night transform in ways they could never have anticipated. And at the center of that narrative was a room high above the city, where the first tangible answers had been found, even as the most important questions remained unresolved. In the hours that followed the discovery inside the room at Mandalay Bay, the investigation expanded outward in every direction at once. It did not move in a straight line. It branched, doubled back, collided with itself, and split again into smaller paths that each carried the weight of possibility. Investigators were not just looking for answers. They were looking for something that would make sense of the scale, the precision, the distance between the man and the people he had targeted. At the center of it all remained Stephen Paddock, but even with his identity confirmed, he did not immediately become understandable. His presence in that room answered the question of who, but it complicated everything else. Because the more they looked, the less obvious the narrative became. The room itself was processed methodically. Every weapon catalogued. Every piece of equipment photographed and documented. The number alone told part of the story. More than 20 firearms, some modified to increase their rate of fire, positioned in a way that suggested forethought rather than impulse. Ammunition stored in quantities that spoke of preparation on a scale that required time, planning, and intent. Investigators moved carefully, aware that each detail might connect to something larger. The placement of the weapons, the presence of tools, the arrangement of furniture, none of it was random. It reflected a sequence of decisions made over days, perhaps longer. The cameras positioned in the hallway added another layer, indicating that Paddock had anticipated the possibility of interruption, that he had taken steps to monitor the space beyond his immediate control. But preparation does not equal explanation. It only deepens the question of why. Outside the hotel, parallel teams began tracing his movements backward. They looked at surveillance footage, transaction records, travel history. Each data point created a timeline, a reconstruction of where he had been and what he had done in the days leading up to the attack. On the surface, much of it appeared ordinary. He checked in. He moved luggage. He interacted minimally with staff. Nothing in those interactions, taken individually, signaled what was coming. That ordinariness became one of the investigation's first challenges. Because investigators are trained to look for deviations, for behaviors that stand out, that break from expected patterns. But in this case, the pattern itself was the disguise. Paddock had operated within the boundaries of normal behavior, using the environment of Las Vegas to his advantage. A city built on constant movement and anonymity offered cover not through secrecy, but through excess. People carried luggage. People came and went at all hours. Nothing about that stood out. The investigation widened. Attention turned to his personal history, his financial records, his relationships. Detectives began to build a profile not just of what he had done, but of who he had been. They spoke to people who had known him in different contexts, neighbors, acquaintances, former associates. Each conversation added a layer, but none provided a clear center. Descriptions of him varied, but they shared a common thread of distance. He was not known for strong emotional connections. He did not leave a trail of conflict or overt instability. He existed on the edges of other people's lives, present but not deeply engaged. That absence of a clear social footprint made it harder to identify a turning point, a moment where something might have shifted. Financially, he appeared stable. There was no immediate indication of desperation, no obvious trigger rooted in economic collapse or sudden loss. His background did not align neatly with the narratives that often emerge in cases of mass violence. There was no manifesto discovered in the early stages, no written declaration that framed his actions within a larger ideology. That absence created space for speculation. And speculation filled the gaps quickly. Early in the investigation, the possibility of additional suspects, or collaborators, could not be ruled out. The scale of the preparation raised questions about whether he had acted alone. Could one person have orchestrated all of this without assistance? Was there someone else who had knowledge of his plans, someone who had helped in ways that were not immediately visible? Law enforcement pursued these questions aggressively. They examined communication records, looking for patterns, for contacts that might suggest coordination. They followed leads that extended beyond Nevada, connecting his movements to other locations where he had spent time. Some leads seemed promising at first. Then they dissolved under closer scrutiny. One of the most closely examined aspects was his relationship with a woman who had been associated with him in the period leading up to the attack. Her whereabouts, her knowledge, her potential involvement, all became focal points of intense investigation. When she was located and interviewed, the process was thorough, probing for any indication that she had been aware of his intentions. But awareness is not always visible. And in this case, investigators found no evidence that she had known what he was planning. Her account, combined with the lack of supporting evidence, led them away from the idea of a broader conspiracy, narrowing the focus back to Paddock himself. Still, the question lingered. If he acted alone, how did he arrive at this point? The investigation turned inward again, examining his mental state, his habits, his patterns of behavior. They looked for signs of deterioration, of escalation, of anything that might suggest a trajectory toward violence. But the data did not align in a way that created a clear path. There were elements that could be interpreted in different ways. His interest in gambling. His reclusive tendencies. His methodical nature. None of these, on their own, indicated what he would eventually do. Even combined, they did not form a profile that pointed inevitably toward mass violence. That ambiguity became one of the defining features of the case. Investigators encountered dead ends not because they lacked information, but because the information did not resolve into a coherent explanation. Each lead that failed to produce clarity reinforced the sense that this case existed outside the frameworks that typically guide understanding. Meanwhile, the public narrative began to take shape, influenced by fragments of information released as the investigation progressed. Media coverage amplified certain aspects, questioned others, and introduced theories that ranged from plausible to speculative. The lack of a clear motive created a vacuum that invited interpretation, each theory attempting to impose structure on something that resisted it. For those working the case, that external noise added another layer of complexity. They had to separate what was verifiable from what was assumed, to focus on evidence rather than narrative. But even within that disciplined approach, the absence of a definitive answer remained. Back at the festival grounds, now transformed into an active crime scene, investigators continued their work. They mapped trajectories, analyzed angles, reconstructed the sequence of events based on physical evidence and witness accounts. This part of the investigation was more concrete, grounded in measurable data. It confirmed what had already been understood, that the shots had come from above, that the position within Mandalay Bay had provided a clear line of sight, that the attack had been executed with calculated efficiency. But even as those details solidified, they did not bring the investigation closer to answering the central question. Why this? Why here? Why now? The deeper they went, the more the case revealed its complexity. It was not a puzzle with missing pieces waiting to be found. It was a puzzle where the pieces existed, but did not form a picture that could be easily recognized. And so the investigation continued, moving through layers of possibility, eliminating what could be disproven, holding on to what could not yet be explained. Each step forward clarified certain aspects, while leaving others unresolved. In the end, the search for suspects led back to the same place. A single room. A single man. And a set of questions that refused to settle into answers. Breakthroughs in investigations are often imagined as sudden moments of clarity, a single discovery that cuts through confusion and rearranges everything into a coherent narrative. But in this case, the breakthrough did not arrive as a revelation. It emerged slowly, almost reluctantly, from the accumulation of details that, when viewed together, began to form something resembling understanding, not of motive, but of method. In the days following the attack, investigators working inside Mandalay Bay returned to the room again and again, each pass revealing something new, not because it had been hidden, but because its significance had not yet been fully grasped. The initial sweep had focused on immediate threats and obvious evidence. Now, the work shifted toward interpretation. It was in the positioning of objects that the first real shift occurred. The weapons themselves had already been catalogued, but their placement began to tell a more detailed story. Some were arranged near the windows, aligned with the angle of fire toward the festival grounds below. Others remained loaded but unused, positioned as alternatives, as if part of a rotation that might have been implemented had the timeline extended further. This was not a random collection. It was a system, one designed to sustain action over time. Then there were the modifications. The presence of bump stocks, devices that allowed semi-automatic rifles to mimic the rate of fire of automatic weapons, shifted the understanding of how the attack had been carried out. It explained the sustained bursts that witnesses had described, the way the gunfire had felt continuous, mechanical, almost detached from the limitations typically associated with civilian firearms. This detail did not explain why, but it clarified how in a way that grounded the event in something tangible. Investigators mapped out the sequence of fire, correlating witness accounts with ballistic evidence. The patterns that emerged suggested movement within the room, a deliberate shifting between positions, weapons, and angles. Stephen Paddock had not remained static. He had adjusted, responded, continued. That realization added a layer of intent that went beyond preparation. It suggested engagement. Outside the room, the cameras he had placed in the hallway became another focal point. Their purpose, at first glance, seemed straightforward, to monitor approaching law enforcement. But as investigators analyzed the setup, they began to understand it as part of a broader mindset. It wasn't just about awareness. It was about control. About extending his perception beyond the immediate space, about reducing uncertainty in an environment where he was otherwise isolated. This was not the behavior of someone acting impulsively. It was the behavior of someone who had anticipated variables and attempted to account for them. Parallel to the physical investigation, digital forensics teams worked to reconstruct his online activity. Hard drives, laptops, and other devices were examined with precision, each file, each search query, each fragment of data scrutinized for meaning. It was in this digital space that another piece of the puzzle began to take shape. Search histories revealed patterns of interest that aligned with the logistics of the attack. Research into locations, crowd densities, vantage points. Queries that suggested not just a plan, but a process of refinement, of narrowing down options based on specific criteria. This was not a spontaneous decision. It was the result of consideration, of comparison. At one point, investigators uncovered evidence that he had looked into other potential targets before settling on the Route 91 Harvest Festival. The implications of that discovery were unsettling. It meant that the event itself, the people who had gathered there, were not chosen for who they were, but for what the setting offered, a combination of visibility, density, and vulnerability. The target was not personal. It was situational. This understanding marked a turning point in how the case was framed. It shifted the focus away from the idea of a specific grievance, or vendetta, and towards something more abstract, more difficult to define. The attack was not directed at individuals, but at a configuration of circumstances that allowed it to unfold in a particular way. As investigators continued to analyze his financial records, another layer of preparation came into view. Purchases of firearms and ammunition had been made over time, distributed in a way that avoided immediate attention. There was no single transaction that stood out as alarming. Instead, there was a pattern of accumulation, gradual and deliberate. He had built the capacity for the attack piece by piece. And he had done so within the boundaries of legality, navigating systems that were not designed to detect intent, only action. That realization carried broader implications, extending beyond the specifics of the case. It raised questions about how risk is identified, how patterns are interpreted, how the absence of overt warning signs can coexist with the presence of underlying preparation. But even as these elements came together, the central question remained unresolved. Why? Investigators revisited his personal history with renewed focus, looking for connections that might align with the level of planning they were now seeing. They examined medical records, searching for indications of cognitive decline, of psychological distress, of anything that might provide a framework for understanding his actions. They looked at his family background, his upbringing, his long-term patterns of behavior. There were fragments that could be interpreted in different ways. A father with a criminal past. A life marked by movement, by a lack of deep, lasting connections. An affinity for gambling that suggested a comfort with risk, with probability, with the idea of outcomes shaped by chance. But none of these fragments coalesced into a clear motive. They remained pieces without a unifying thread. The breakthrough, if it could be called that, was not the discovery of a reason. It was the realization that a reason, in the conventional sense, might not exist. Or at least, not one that could be easily articulated or universally understood. This shifted the investigation into a different phase. Instead of searching for a singular explanation, investigators began to document the totality of what could be known. They focused on establishing a comprehensive account of the events, of the preparation, of the execution. They aimed to create a record that was as complete as possible, even if it could not answer every question. Back in Las Vegas, the impact of the attack continued to unfold. The physical evidence provided clarity on how the event had occurred, but the emotional and psychological dimensions remained complex, layered, resistant to simplification. For those directly affected, the absence of a clear motive was not an abstract issue. It was personal. It meant there was no narrative to anchor the experience, no explanation that could be held onto as a way of making sense of what had happened. The randomness implied by the situational targeting made the event feel both distant and uncomfortably universal. It could have been anywhere. It could have been anyone. As the investigation progressed, this understanding became part of the case itself. Not just the facts of what had occurred, but the limits of what could be known. The recognition that even with exhaustive analysis, some aspects would remain beyond reach. And in that recognition, the nature of the breakthrough became clear. It was not about solving the mystery. It was about defining its boundaries. About understanding how far the evidence could take them, and where it would inevitably fall short. Because sometimes, the most important discovery in an investigation is not the answer to a question. It is the realization that the question itself may never be fully answered. Justice, in most cases, follows a familiar path. There is an arrest, a courtroom, a sequence of arguments that attempt to reconstruct the past in a way that allows it to be judged in the present. There are faces, of the accused, of the victims, of the families, each carrying a different version of the same story. There is a verdict, a sentence, a formal conclusion that signals the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. But in this case, that path had already been broken. By the time law enforcement entered the room inside Mandalay Bay, Stephen Paddock had removed himself from the possibility of standing trial. There would be no courtroom confrontation, no opportunity to question him directly, no moment where he would be asked to account for what he had done. The absence of that process reshaped everything that followed. Because justice, without a defendant, becomes something else. It becomes an effort to create accountability, in a space where the primary source of answers is no longer available. In the weeks after the attack, officials in Hoa Kai began the process of formalizing what had happened. Investigative findings were compiled into reports, each detail documented with the precision required for an event of this magnitude. These reports served a purpose beyond record-keeping. They became the closest thing to testimony, a structured narrative built from evidence rather than personal admission. For the families of those who had died, and for the hundreds who had been injured, this process offered a form of recognition. It acknowledged that what had happened was not just an isolated incident, but a significant event that demanded thorough examination. But recognition is not the same as resolution. In the absence of a trial, there was no single moment where the story would be presented in full, where the facts would be laid out in a way that allowed for direct confrontation. Instead, the information emerged gradually, through press conferences, official statements, and the slow release of investigative conclusions. Each new detail filled in part of the picture. None of them completed it. For many, the idea of justice extended beyond the individual who had carried out the attack. Questions began to surface about systems, about policies, about the broader context that had allowed such an event to occur. Legal discussions emerged around the use of bump stocks, the devices that had enabled Stephen Paddock to sustain rapid gunfire. These discussions moved from the realm of investigation into the realm of legislation, where different kinds of accountability could be pursued. In 2018, the federal government enacted a ban on bump stocks, redefining them in a way that classified them alongside fully automatic weapons. This decision did not come directly from a courtroom tied to the case, but it was undeniably shaped by what had happened. It represented a form of response, an attempt to address one aspect of the method that had been used. But even that step carried its own complexities. For some, it was a necessary action, a tangible outcome that suggested the system could adapt in response to tragedy. For others, it was insufficient, addressing a single element without engaging with broader questions about access, regulation, and prevention. The debate itself became part of the aftermath, a continuation of the event in a different form. Meanwhile, civil lawsuits began to take shape. These cases sought to assign responsibility in ways that extended beyond the individual perpetrator. Plaintiffs looked at the role of the hotel, the event organizers, and other entities connected to the circumstances of the attack. They examined security measures, response protocols, and the feasibility of anticipating a threat that had come from outside the expected framework. The legal arguments were complex, often hinging on questions of foreseeability. Could this have been predicted? Should additional measures have been in place? What constitutes reasonable preparation for an event of this scale? In courtrooms across the country, these questions were explored not as abstract ideas, but as matters with real consequences. Settlements were reached in some cases, providing financial compensation to victims and their families. These outcomes, while significant, carried an inherent limitation. They could address impact. They could not restore what had been lost. For survivors, the pursuit of justice took on deeply personal dimensions. Some chose to engage with the legal process, seeking acknowledgement through formal channels. Others stepped away from it, finding that the structure of litigation did not align with what they needed to move forward. There was no single path, no uniform response that could encompass the range of experiences that had emerged from that night. Public memorials became another form of collective response. Spaces were created where people could gather, reflect, and remember. Names were spoken, stories shared, lives honored in ways that resisted reduction to statistics. These moments did not function as justice in the legal sense, but they carried their own kind of weight. They affirmed that the individuals who had been lost were not defined solely by the way their lives had ended. They had existed fully, beyond that moment. In the broader cultural landscape, the event continued to resonate. It became a reference point in discussions about mass violence, about the limits of prevention, about the ways in which modern society grapples with acts that defy easy explanation. The absence of a trial meant that there was no definitive narrative imposed by a courtroom. Instead, the story remained open, shaped by interpretation, by perspective, by the ongoing process of trying to understand. For investigators, the conclusion of their formal work did not carry the same sense of closure that might accompany a conviction. They had documented the evidence, established the sequence of events, identified the individual responsible. But the lack of a motive, the absence of a direct explanation, meant that their work ended with an acknowledgement of uncertainty. And that uncertainty became part of the case's legacy. In Las Vegas, the physical spaces connected to the event began to change. The festival grounds were cleared, the temporary structures removed. The hotel continued to operate, its exterior unchanged, its interior adjusted in ways that were not always visible to the public. Life in the city moved forward, as it always does, absorbing the impact while maintaining the rhythms that define it. But beneath that continuity, something had shifted. The idea of safety, once assumed, had been challenged in a way that could not be fully reversed. Justice, in this context, became less about a single outcome and more about a series of responses. Legal, legislative, personal, collective. Each one addressing a different aspect of the event, each one incomplete on its own. Because when the person responsible is no longer present to face judgment, the process of accountability disperses. It moves into different arenas, takes on different forms, reaches different conclusions. And none of them, on their own, can fully answer what happened that night. But together, they create a framework, a way of acknowledging the event, of responding to it, of ensuring that it is neither ignored nor forgotten. Not a resolution, but a reckoning. In the months that followed, the story of that night did not end, it settled. Not into something calm or resolved, but into something quieter, more persistent. It moved out of headlines and into memory, into the spaces where people carried it with them in ways that were not always visible. The aftermath was not defined by a single moment, but by a series of smaller ones, unfolding over time, each shaped by the weight of what had already happened. For those who had been there, the memory did not exist as a continuous narrative. It came in fragments. A sound that didn't belong. The sudden shift in the crowd. The feeling of the ground beneath their hands. These details surfaced unpredictably, triggered by things that, on the surface, had nothing to do with that night. A song playing on the radio. The echo of something sharp and unexpected. The sight of a large gathering of people in an open space. Each fragment carried the same underlying question, even if it was never spoken out loud. How did something like this happen? In Las Vegas, the physical landscape adjusted in subtle ways. The Strip continued to glow, the flow of visitors remained constant, the illusion of uninterrupted spectacle maintained its surface. But beneath that continuity, there was an awareness that hadn't been there before. It wasn't always visible, and it didn't define every moment, but it existed, a quiet acknowledgement that even in a place built on control and performance, there were limits to what could be predicted or prevented. The site of the Route 91 Harvest Festival did not return to what it had been. The open lot, once filled with music and movement, became something else entirely. It existed now as a space marked by absence, its significance defined not by what it held, but by what had been taken from it. Discussions emerged about how to treat that space, whether to transform it into something permanent, something that could hold memory in a way that felt appropriate. Memory, however, does not always align with physical structures. For some, the idea of a permanent memorial offered a place to focus grief, to create a point of connection that could be returned to. For others, it risked fixing the event in a way that made it harder to move forward, to allow life to continue without being anchored to that single moment. There was no consensus. Only perspectives shaped by individual experience. Across the HOA Chi, the broader conversation continued, influenced by the scale and nature of what had happened. The attack became part of a larger pattern, one that had been developing over years, each incident adding to a collective understanding that remained incomplete. Policy debates intensified, focusing on access to firearms, on regulatory gaps, on the balance between individual rights and collective safety. These discussions often moved in cycles. Moments of urgency followed by periods of relative quiet. The event in Las Vegas remained a reference point, cited in arguments, analyzed in reports, revisited in media coverage that sought to extract meaning from something that resisted simplification. Experts examined data, trends, behavioral patterns, searching for indicators that might help prevent future incidents. They looked for signals in the noise, for anything that could transform unpredictability into something more manageable. But the absence of a clear motive in this case complicated those efforts. Without a defined reason, it became harder to identify warning signs, harder to build models that could anticipate similar behavior. The case existed as both a data point and an outlier, contributing to understanding while also challenging the frameworks used to create it. For the families of those who were lost, the passage of time did not reduce the significance of what had happened. It changed the way it was experienced. Grief, in its early stages, often feels immediate, overwhelming, tied to the shock of absence. Over time, it shifts, becoming something that integrates into daily life in ways that are less visible, but no less present. Moments that once felt ordinary take on new meaning. A birthday. A holiday. A quiet evening that now includes an empty space where someone should be. These moments do not announce themselves. They arrive quietly, carrying with them the weight of memory. For survivors, the aftermath often involved navigating a different kind of uncertainty. Physical injuries healed at different rates, some leaving lasting effects that extended beyond what could be seen. Psychological impacts followed their own timelines, sometimes emerging long after the immediate crisis had passed. The experience of being present during the attack created a connection to the event that could not be easily set aside. Support systems formed, both formal and informal. Counseling services, support groups, communities of individuals who shared the experience. These spaces allowed for the exchange of stories, for the validation of feelings that might otherwise feel isolating. They provided a framework for processing something that did not come with clear instructions. But even within these spaces, the question of why remained. It surfaced in conversations, in moments of reflection, in the quiet spaces between words. Not always demanding an answer, but never fully disappearing. The legacy of Stephen Paddock became defined not by what he said, but by what he left unsaid. His silence extended beyond his death, shaping the way the event was understood. Without a statement of intent, without a clear articulation of motive, his actions existed in a space that resisted narrative closure. This absence created a different kind of impact. It shifted the focus away from the individual and toward the collective experience of those affected. The story became less about him and more about the people whose lives had been intersected by his actions, about the ways in which they continued to move forward. In that shift, something important emerged. A recognition that while the event could not be fully explained, it could still be acknowledged, remembered, and learned from. The process of learning, however, is not straightforward. It involves examining uncomfortable realities, questioning assumptions, accepting that some risks cannot be entirely eliminated. It requires balancing the desire for safety with the understanding that unpredictability is an inherent part of human behavior. In Las Vegas, the city adapted in ways that were both visible and subtle. Security measures were reviewed, adjusted, expanded. Event planning incorporated new considerations, new layers of awareness. These changes did not erase what had happened, but they reflected an attempt to respond, to evolve in the face of something that had exposed vulnerabilities. Life continued. It always does. People returned to the Strip, to concerts, to gatherings that echoed the structure of the event that had been disrupted. They did so with varying degrees of awareness, some carrying the memory more consciously than others. The capacity to gather, to celebrate, to create shared experiences did not disappear. But it was no longer untouched. The night of October 1st became part of the city's story, woven into its identity in a way that could not be separated out. It existed alongside everything else, the lights, the music, the constant motion, adding a layer of depth that was not immediately visible, but always present. And in that presence, the aftermath continued. Not as a single chapter that could be closed, but as an ongoing process of remembering, of adapting, of living with the knowledge that some events do not resolve neatly, that some questions remain unanswered, that some stories continue long after the moment that defined them has passed. Because the true impact of that night was not confined to the minutes in which it unfolded. It extended outward, into time, into memory, into the lives of everyone it touched. And it remains there still. Time does not erase an event like this. It reshapes it. It takes something immediate and chaotic and turns it into something quieter, more internal, something that exists not in the open, but within the people who lived through it. By the time the first anniversary approached, the story of that night had already shifted from breaking news into something more enduring, something that lived in memory, in ritual, in the ways people chose to remember and the ways they tried, sometimes unsuccessfully, to forget. In Las Vegas, the days leading up to that anniversary carried a different kind of tension. It wasn't the sharp, disorienting fear of that night, but a slower, more deliberate awareness. People knew the date was coming. They felt it in the conversations that grew more frequent, in the subtle changes in tone when the topic surfaced. The city prepared in ways that were both visible and understated, acknowledging the significance without overwhelming the everyday rhythm that had gradually re-established itself. Memorial events were organized, spaces designated for reflection. Names were read aloud, each one given the time and attention that had been impossible in the immediate aftermath when numbers dominated the narrative. In these moments, the scale of the loss was reframed through individuality. Each name represented a life that had existed fully, with its own history, its own connections, its own future that had been interrupted. For the families, these ceremonies were both necessary and difficult. They offered a place to gather, to share grief that might otherwise feel isolating. But they also required a return to the moment, a revisiting of details that time had not softened as much as one might hope. Grief does not follow a linear path. It moves in cycles, sometimes receding, sometimes returning with unexpected intensity. Anniversaries have a way of amplifying that cycle. They create a focal point, a moment where memory becomes unavoidable. For survivors, the approach of that date often brought with it a resurgence of sensations that had been pushed to the edges of awareness. The body remembers in ways the mind cannot always control. A tightening in the chest. A heightened sensitivity to sound. A sudden awareness of exits in any crowded space. These responses were not choices. They were adaptations, remnants of an experience that had required immediate, instinctive action. Some found ways to channel these responses into something constructive. They became advocates, speaking publicly about their experiences, contributing to discussions about safety, about preparedness, about the human impact of mass violence. Their voices carried a weight that statistics could not replicate. They spoke not just about what had happened, but about how it continued to shape their lives. Others chose a more private path. They stepped away from the public narrative, focusing instead on rebuilding a sense of normalcy that felt authentic to them. For some, that meant avoiding large gatherings. For others, it meant returning to them deliberately, confronting the fear in controlled ways, reclaiming spaces that had been altered by memory. There was no single way to move forward. Only individual paths shaped by personal experience. The broader conversation in the HOA CAI continued to evolve as well. The attack in Las Vegas remained a point of reference, but it became part of a larger pattern, one that included other events, other locations, other stories that carried similar elements of sudden violence and unresolved questions. Each new incident brought the conversation back into focus, reigniting debates that had never fully settled. Policy discussions persisted, often circling familiar points of contention. The regulation of firearms, the identification of potential threats, the role of mental health, the balance between security and personal freedom. These conversations were complex, influenced by political, cultural, and social factors that extended far beyond any single event. The challenge was not just in finding solutions. It was in agreeing on the nature of the problem. Within this landscape, the legacy of Stephen Paddock remained defined by absence. There was still no clear motive, no definitive explanation that could anchor the narrative. This absence continued to shape the way the event was understood, leaving space for interpretation, but resisting any attempt at simplification. For some, this lack of explanation was the most difficult aspect to accept. Human nature seeks patterns, reasons, causes that can be identified and, ideally, addressed. When those elements are missing, the event feels less contained, less predictable. It challenges the assumption that with enough information, everything can be understood. In this case, understanding had limits. And those limits became part of the story. Back in Las Vegas, the physical spaces connected to the event continued to evolve. The site of the festival remained a point of discussion, its future tied to decisions about how best to honor what had happened without allowing it to define the space entirely. Proposals were made, plans considered, each reflecting different perspectives on memory and meaning. The hotel, Mandalay Bay, continued to operate, its role in the event acknowledged, but not allowed to overshadow its broader identity. Guests returned, rooms were occupied, the routines of hospitality resumed. But for those who knew the story, the building carried an additional layer of significance, one that was not immediately visible but impossible to ignore. This coexistence of normalcy and memory became a defining feature of the aftermath. Life did not stop. But it did not return to what it had been either. The passage of time introduced new perspectives. What had once felt immediate began to be contextualized within a broader timeline. The event became part of history, studied, analyzed, referenced in ways that extended beyond personal experience. Researchers examined data, looking for patterns that might inform future prevention efforts. Psychologists explored the impact of trauma, the ways in which individuals and communities process events of this magnitude. These efforts contributed to a growing body of knowledge. But they did not resolve the emotional core of the event. Because at its center, the story remained about people. About the lives that had been lost, the ones that had been changed, the connections that had been altered in ways that could not be fully measured. As the years continued to pass, the intensity of public attention would inevitably shift. New stories would emerge, new events would capture focus. But for those directly affected, the timeline would remain different. The night of October 1st would not recede into the past in the same way. It would remain present. Not always at the forefront, but never entirely gone. In quiet moments, in unexpected triggers, in the spaces where memory surfaces without warning. The aftermath, then, is not a single phase that follows the event. It is an ongoing process. One that unfolds over time, shaped by individual experience, by collective response, by the ways in which people choose to remember and to move forward. And within that process, the story continues. Not as a fixed narrative, but as something living, evolving, carried forward by those who experienced it and those who seek to understand it. Because some events do not end. They change form. There is a moment, in the life of every story like this, when attention begins to drift. Not because the event becomes less significant, but because the world, by its nature, continues to move forward. New headlines replace old ones. New crises demand focus. The sharp edges of public awareness soften, not disappearing, but settling into the background. For many, the night of October 1st becomes something they remember when prompted, something they recognize as important, but no longer feel in the same immediate way. But for those who lived through it, the timeline does not follow that pattern. Their version of the story continues in quieter ways, in spaces that are not always visible to others. It exists in routines that have been subtly altered, in decisions made without conscious thought, in the way a person scans a room upon entering, noting exits, measuring distances, assessing the environment with a level of awareness that was not there before. In Las Vegas, this layered reality becomes part of the city's identity. It is not something advertised or displayed openly, but it is present, woven into the experiences of those who call the city home, and those who return to it with memory attached. The Strip still glows. The music still plays. Crowds still gather in spaces designed for celebration. But beneath that surface, there is an understanding that did not exist before, a recognition that even the most carefully constructed environments have vulnerabilities. For survivors, the process of rebuilding is not about returning to who they were before. It is about becoming someone new. This transformation does not happen all at once. It unfolds gradually, shaped by choices both large and small. Some people find themselves drawn toward connection, seeking out others who share their experience, building communities that provide a sense of understanding that cannot be found elsewhere. In these spaces, stories are exchanged not as a way of reliving the past, but as a way of integrating it, of making it part of a narrative that continues to evolve. Others move in a different direction, focusing on independence, on reclaiming a sense of control that was disrupted. They set boundaries, limit exposure to reminders, create environments where they can feel grounded again. For them, healing is not about revisiting the event, but about creating distance from it. Both paths are valid. Both reflect the complexity of human response to trauma. In the broader context of the HOA Kai, the event continues to exist as part of an ongoing conversation about safety, about risk, about the nature of violence in modern society. It is referenced in policy discussions, in academic research, in media analysis that seeks to draw connections between individual cases and larger patterns. But there is a tension within that conversation. A tension between the need to generalize and the reality of specificity. Because while patterns can be identified, while trends can be analyzed, each event carries its own unique set of circumstances. The attack carried out by Stephen Paddock does not fit neatly into every framework used to understand mass violence. Its lack of a clear motive, its method, its scale, all of these elements resist easy categorization. This resistance becomes part of its significance. It challenges assumptions. It forces a reconsideration of what is known and what remains uncertain. For experts studying behavior, the case presents a paradox. On one hand, it offers a wealth of data, detailed timelines, documented actions, physical evidence that can be analyzed and interpreted. On the other hand, it lacks the narrative clarity that often accompanies such data, the explanatory thread that connects action to intention in a way that feels complete. This gap becomes a focal point of study. Not as a problem to be solved, but as a boundary to be understood. What does it mean when an act of this magnitude cannot be fully explained? How does that uncertainty affect the way prevention strategies are developed, the way risk is assessed, the way resources are allocated? These questions do not have simple answers. But they continue to be asked. Back in Las Vegas, the physical environment continues to adapt in subtle ways. Event organizers incorporate new protocols, new layers of awareness that reflect lessons learned. Security measures evolve, not always in ways that are visible to the public, but in ways that influence how spaces are designed and managed. These changes are part of a broader effort to reduce risk. But they also reflect an understanding that risk cannot be entirely eliminated. That unpredictability remains a factor that must be acknowledged. For those who return to large gatherings, whether in Las Vegas or elsewhere, this awareness becomes part of the experience. It does not necessarily diminish the enjoyment, but it adds a layer of consciousness that was not always present before. People notice things differently. They pay attention to details that might have once gone unnoticed. In some ways, this heightened awareness becomes a form of adaptation. A way of navigating a world that feels more complex, more uncertain. The story of that night continues to be told, but it changes depending on who is telling it. For some, it is a story of loss, defined by the absence of someone who should still be there. For others, it is a story of survival, of moments where decisions made under pressure had lasting consequences. For investigators, it is a case study, a collection of facts and findings that contribute to a larger body of knowledge. Each version is true. Each captures a different aspect of the same event. And none of them, on their own, can fully encompass what happened. This multiplicity of perspectives becomes part of the story's ongoing life. It exists not as a single narrative, but as a network of experiences that intersect and diverge in ways that reflect the complexity of the event itself. In that complexity, there is a kind of continuity. A recognition that the story does not end with the conclusion of the investigation, or the passage of time, or the fading of public attention. It continues in the lives of those who carry it. In the decisions they make. In the ways they understand the world around them. And in the questions that remain, even as other aspects of the story become clearer. Because some questions are not meant to be answered completely. They exist as reminders of the limits of understanding, of the unpredictability of human behavior, of the need to remain aware, even in moments that feel safe. As time moves forward, the night of October 1st becomes part of history, but it does not lose its relevance. It remains a point of reference, a moment that continues to influence how people think about safety, about community, about the fragile balance between normalcy and disruption. And within that ongoing influence, the story persists. Not as something fixed or finished, but as something that continues to shape and be shaped by the world around it.